The guttural roar of the John Deere's engine was the soundtrack to my life. For 40 years, that beast, its chassis a sun-bleached emerald green, had been my partner in coaxing life from this stubborn patch of earth. It was a rhythm etched into my bones, a symphony of diesel and dirt that spoke of sweat, sacrifice, and the quiet satisfaction of a harvest reaped. My name is Silas Blackwood, and this farm, this land, it was more than just property. It was legacy, a whispered promise passed down from my father, and before him, his father. The morning had started like any other. The sun, a hazy smear of orange through the perpetual dust, was just beginning its ascent, painting the sky in shades of rose and apricot. I'd pulled on my worn overalls, the denim faded to the color of a summer storm cloud, and headed to the barn. The air, thick with the scent of hay and damp earth, was a familiar comfort. My fingers, calloused and ingrained with soil, ran over the cool metal of the tractor's steering wheel. A silent greeting. Today it was the West 40, the stubborn clay that always demanded a bit more coaxing. That's when I heard it. Not the usual chirping of sparrows or the distant lowing of cattle, but a sharp, metallic clang, followed by a woman's shrill voice. It cut through the morning quiet like a rusty blade. My heart, usually steady as a plow horse, gave a jolt. That voice, it belonged to Eleanor Vance. Eleanor. The name itself tasted like bitter bile in my mouth. She'd bought the old Henderson place 2 years ago, a sprawling Victorian monstrosity that sat on the edge of my land. She was a city woman, all sharp angles and sharper words, with eyes that seemed to survey everything with a perpetual sneer. She'd arrived like a foreign object, a misplaced ornament in our quiet, rural landscape. We'd exchanged pleasantries, stiff and forced, but it was clear from the outset that we spoke different languages. Mine was of seasons and soil. Hers, of property lines and what she deemed nuisance. I climbed off the tractor, wiping my hands on my overalls. The clang came again, louder this time, closer. Curiosity, a dangerous beast in these parts, tugged at me. I walked towards the fence line, the dew-kissed grass cool beneath my worn boots. And then I saw her. Eleanor stood by the fence, her posture rigid, her face a mask of indignant fury. She was dressed in what passed for her farming attire, a pristine white linen shirt and tailored khaki pants, utterly out of place amidst the rough and tumble reality of rural life. In her hand, she clutched a pair of gardening shears, and she was attempting to snip at the overgrown honeysuckle that had dared to creep its tendrils across the boundary. "Eleanor," I called out, my voice a low rumble, trying to keep the weariness out of it. "What are you doing?" She spun around, her eyes narrowing. "Silas, I'm attempting to reclaim my property from your overgrowth." The word overgrowth was spat out with such disdain, as if the very concept of nature encroaching was a personal affront. "That's just honeysuckle, Eleanor. It's been there for years. Wild." "Wild or not," she retorted, her voice rising, "it's on my side. And frankly, Silas, your entire operation is a blight on this neighborhood." My jaw tightened. "My operation, as you so eloquently put it, puts food on tables, Eleanor. It's what this land is for." "It's noisy, it's messy, and it's frankly an eyesore. And that infernal machine of yours," she gestured wildly towards my John Deere, which stood proudly in the field, its chrome glinting in the nascent sunlight, "is an assault on the senses. I've had enough." Enough of what? Enough of the natural order of things? Enough of the life that had always pulsed through this valley? "What are you going to do about it, Eleanor?" I asked, a hint of a challenge in my tone. I'd dealt with her petty complaints before, the barking of my old hound, the smell of manure, the occasional dust cloud from the fields. She was a constant thorn, but a manageable one. She took a step back, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "I've called the sheriff." The words hung in the air, stark and absurd. The sheriff? For honeysuckle? For the sound of a tractor? "The sheriff?" I repeated, a disbelieving laugh escaping my lips. "What in tarnation do you think Sheriff Brody is going to do about a bit of honeysuckle?" "He's coming to deal with the nuisance," she said, her voice clipped and final. "To remove the source of the problem, your tractor." My laughter died in my throat. Remove my tractor. The John Deere, the very symbol of my livelihood, my independence, my connection to this land? The thought was preposterous, infuriating. My hands balled into fists. "You can't be serious, Eleanor. He's not going to just take my tractor." "Oh, he will," she said, a smug smile spreading across her face. "I've made quite a convincing case. Nuisance vehicle, noise pollution, trespass, you name it. He's on his way now." I stared at her, speechless. The sheer audacity, the utter disconnect from reality. She was a city dweller, a woman who probably thought milk came from a carton, trying to dictate terms to a man who had lived and breathed this land for his entire life. The distant wail of a siren, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, confirmed her words. My stomach plummeted. Sheriff Brody. He was a good man, a fair man, but he was also bound by the law. And Eleanor Vance, with her manicured nails and her carefully constructed grievances, had twisted the law into something ugly and weaponized. I turned and strode back towards the barn, the ground feeling suddenly unsteady beneath my feet. The John Deere, my trusty steed, stood waiting. The idea of it being hauled away, of it being declared a nuisance, was a physical blow. It wasn't just metal and rubber. It was the sweat of my brow, the ache in my muscles, the silent understanding between man and machine that had sustained me through droughts, floods, and the relentless march of time. As I reached the tractor, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A black and white patrol car idled at the end of my driveway, its lights flashing a silent, ominous rhythm. Sheriff Brody, a burly man with a kind face and a perpetually weary sigh, emerged from the driver's seat. Beside him, however, stood a figure that made my breath catch in my throat. He was tall, lean, and moved with a quiet confidence that belied his youth. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleamed. But it wasn't the uniform that stopped me. It was the face. The familiar set of the jaw, the same earnest eyes that I remembered from a much smaller, much more mischievous boy. It was my nephew, Daniel. Daniel, my sister's son. The boy I'd practically raised after his father passed. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike, to skip stones, to understand the delicate balance of the natural world. The boy who, just a few years ago, had stood on this very spot, looking up at me with wide, adoring eyes. The world tilted. Sheriff Brody, a man I respected, was here to enforce Eleanor Vance's ridiculous demand, and standing next to him, looking every inch the authority figure, was Daniel. My Daniel. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Shock, disbelief, a flicker of anger, and beneath it all, a deep, gnawing ache of confusion. What was Daniel doing here, and why was he dressed as a sheriff? The answer, when it finally dawned on me, was so absurd, so utterly improbable, that it felt like a punch to the gut. Daniel wasn't just visiting. Daniel wasn't just accompanying Sheriff Brody. Daniel was the sheriff, or at least he was a deputy, a sworn officer of the law, and he was here, standing on my sound land, about to be involved in the removal of my signed tractor at the behest of Eleanor Vance. The realization hit me with the force of a runaway hay baler. I, Silas Blackwood, a man who prided himself on his self-sufficiency, and his ability to handle his own problems, was about to be publicly humiliated by my own nephew, who was acting under the orders of a woman who despised everything I stood for. The irony was so thick, so suffocating, that I almost couldn't breathe. I looked from Eleanor, her face a picture of smug satisfaction, to Sheriff Brody, his brow furrowed with a hint of unease, and finally to Daniel. He met my gaze, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or a shadow of regret. But it was quickly masked by the professional demeanor he had clearly cultivated. The engine of the John Deere, still humming softly, felt like a heartbeat in the sudden, suffocating silence. It was a sound of defiance, a sound of life, a sound that Eleanor Vance, in her sterile world, could never understand. And now, it was threatened. I took a deep breath, the scent of diesel and dust filling my lungs. This was not how it was supposed to happen. This was not how my life, my legacy, was supposed to be threatened. This was not how my nephew was supposed to be involved. And yet, here we were. The beginning of the end of something, or perhaps the beginning of something entirely unexpected. The gears of fate, it seemed, had just shifted with an almighty grind. The guttural roar of the John Deere's engine was the soundtrack to my life, a symphony of diesel and dirt that had been playing for 40 years. It was a sound I understood, a sound that spoke of honest work, of coaxing life from the earth. But today, it felt more like a defiant bellow against the encroaching tide of Eleanor Vance. Her voice, sharp and brittle as a dried cornstalk, cut through the morning quiet like a rusty blade. "That infernal machine of yours," she'd spat, her words laced with a disdain I knew too well. "It's an assault on the senses, a blight on this neighborhood." And then, the kicker, the words that had made my heart, usually steady as a plow horse, give a jolt. "I've called the sheriff to remove it. It's a nuisance vehicle, and frankly, it's an eyesore that disrupts the natural order of things." The natural order of things, she'd said. As if her manicured lawns and her insistence on silence were the natural order. And my tractor, my partner in coaxing life from this very soil, was some kind of blight. The sheer audacity, the utter disconnect from reality, still made my jaw tighten. The woman probably thought milk came from a carton, not from Bessie out in the West 40. And then he'd arrived. Not just the sheriff, no, that would have been bad enough. But Daniel, my nephew. Daniel. The boy I'd practically raised, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose first wobbly bicycle rides I'd supervised. The boy who'd spent summers out here, his small hands eager to help, his eyes wide with wonder at the rhythm of farm life. He'd come with Sheriff Brody, not as a bystander, but as a deputy. The realization had hit me with the force of a runaway hay baler. Daniel, my Daniel, a sworn officer of the law, here to enforce Eleanor Vance's ridiculous demands. My own blood standing with the enemy. The ground felt suddenly unsteady beneath my worn boots. Sheriff Brody, bless his weary soul, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He was a burly man, with a kind face etched with the kind of lines that spoke of long hours and difficult decisions. He'd sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of every complaint he'd ever fielded, as he'd surveyed the scene. The pristine white linen shirt and tailored khaki pants of Eleanor Vance, looking utterly out of place against the backdrop of sun-baked earth and the rugged chassis of my tractor. And then there was Daniel. He stood a little straighter, his uniform a stark, unfamiliar contrast to the faded denim and flannel I was accustomed to. He had a professional demeanor he had clearly cultivated, a carefully constructed shield that hid the much smaller, much more mischievous boy I remembered. "Silas," Sheriff Brody had begun, his voice a low rumble. "We've received a complaint about the tractor, and some other things." He gestured vaguely towards Eleanor's meticulously trimmed hedge, where the honeysuckle, a wild, fragrant tangle, had dared to creep its tendrils. Eleanor had seized on it. "Overgrowth!" she'd practically shrieked. "And noise pollution. That machine is a constant disturbance. It's a nuisance vehicle, Sheriff. It has to go." She'd spat out the word nuisance with such disdain, as if it were a particularly unpleasant insect she'd just discovered on her property. And Daniel? He'd stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed somewhere between me and the tractor. I remembered teaching him to drive a stick shift in my old pickup truck, his brow furrowed with concentration, his knuckles white. Now, that same furrow was present, but it was laced with something else, a professional reserve that felt like a physical barrier between us. "Mr. Blackwood," Daniel had said, his voice surprisingly steady, devoid of the boyish lilt I still sometimes heard in my head. It was the voice of authority, of duty. "Ms. Vance has filed a formal complaint under County Ordinance 34B regarding excessive noise and blight to adjoining properties. The tractor is considered a primary source of the disturbance. My tractor, my trusted steed, my livelihood, my independence, my connection to this land, considered a blight." The thought was preposterous, infuriating. It was a symbol of a life that had always pulsed through this valley, a life that Eleanor Vance, with her carefully constructed grievances, had twisted the law into something ugly and weaponized. "Ordinance 34B, I'd managed to choke out, the words tasting like bitter bile. "What in tarnation are you talking about, Daniel? That's my tractor. It's how I make my living." Sheriff Brody had rubbed the back of his neck. "Silas, I understand. But Ms. Vance has presented a case, and Daniel here," he'd gestured to my nephew as if introducing a stranger, "is following procedure. The tractor is parked too close to the property line, according to her measurements. And the noise... Well, it's a busy road, Silas, and that engine is loud." Loud? It was the sound of life, of honest toil. It was the sound that had always been part of the fabric of this place, as natural as the buzz of the cicadas or the lowing of cattle. Eleanor Vance, with her sterile world of hushed tones and manicured perfection, couldn't comprehend that. And Daniel was supposed to understand. He'd grown up with that sound. He'd practically lived on this farm for years. But he hadn't lived here for a while. He'd gone off to college, then to the academy. He'd traded his overalls for a uniform, his calloused hands for polished badges. He'd entered a different world, a world of rules and regulations, a world where a tractor could be deemed a nuisance vehicle. "You're actually going to make me move my tractor?" I'd asked Daniel, my voice rough with a disbelief that bordered on anger. "The machine I've had for 15 years? The one that's helped me put food on the table and hay in the barn?" Daniel's brow furrowed, a hint of unease flickering in his otherwise professional gaze. "Silas, I'm just doing my job. Ms. Vance filed a legitimate complaint. I have to respond." "Legitimate?" Eleanor had crowed, stepping forward, her eyes glinting. "Mr. Blackwood, your entire operation is a blight on this neighborhood. And that behemoth of yours is the worst offender. It's an affront to peace and quiet. I have a right to enjoy my property, and your tractor is preventing that." I looked at Daniel, searching for a flicker of the boy I knew, the boy who'd once chased fireflies with me in the twilight. But I found only the deputy, his face impassive, his posture rigid. He was a man of law now, and the law, it seemed, had no room for sentimentality, no understanding of the deep, gnawing ache of confusion that was washing over me. "So," I said, my voice dangerously low, "you're telling me you're going to tow my tractor?" The idea was so absurd, so utterly impossible, that a disbelieving laugh escaped my lips, a harsh, dry sound that echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence. Eleanor Vance's mask of indignant fury tightened. "It's not a matter of towing, Mr. Blackwood. It's a matter of removal. Sheriff Brody has the authority to order its relocation." Sheriff Brody shifted his weight, his gaze darting between me and Daniel. "Silas, we don't want to make this difficult. Ms. Vance has presented evidence of excessive noise and visual pollution. The ordinance is clear. Visual pollution. My tractor. The machine that was a symbol of my life, my independence, my connection to this land. It was like she was calling my life itself a pollution." Then Daniel spoke again, his voice a little softer this time, though still firm. "Silas, I understand this is hard. But the law is the law. Ms. Vance has the right to her peace and quiet, just as you have the right to farm. But your farming practices, in this instance, are infringing on her rights." He'd said it. He'd said I was infringing on her rights. The words hung in the air, stark and absurd. I looked at the emerald green chassis of my John Deere, gleaming dully in the morning sun, a steadfast, familiar presence. It was more than just metal and diesel. It was a legacy, a testament to generations of Blackwoods who had worked this land. And now, my own nephew, the boy I'd practically raised, was here to take it away. "You wrote his deed, didn't you?" I said, the question escaping my lips before I could stop it. It was a wild guess, a desperate attempt to grasp at some explanation, some leverage. Daniel's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor Vance, her face a picture of impatience, turned towards him. "What are you talking about, Mr. Blackwood? Deeds? This is about a tractor." But Daniel's professional mask had slipped, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or a shadow of regret, crossed his face. He looked at me, then at Eleanor, then back at me. The gears of fate, it seemed, had just shifted with an almighty grind. And I, Silas Blackwood, stood on the precipice of a reality I had never, in my wildest dreams, imagined. The crunch of tires on gravel was a sound I knew like the back of my own calloused hand. It was the symphony of diesel and dirt, the herald of a delivery truck, or a neighbor stopping by for a cup of coffee and a yarn. But this crunch was different. It was too precise, too deliberate. It was the sound of authority arriving, and it was accompanied by the jarring, metallic clang of a car door slamming shut, followed by another, and then the low thrum of an engine that wasn't meant for these fields. My breath hitched. I'd been out by the West 40, coaxing life from earth that was beginning to show the strain of a dry spell, my John Deere, my trusty steed, humming beneath me. The sun, a hazy smear of orange through the dust motes dancing in the air, was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of rose and apricot. It was the kind of evening that usually settled a man's soul. Until the flashing lights, a patrol car, stark white and black, had pulled up past my barn, its lights strobing a silent, ominous rhythm against the fading light. And standing beside it, a figure that made the ground beneath my boots feel suddenly unsteady. Eleanor Vance, all sharp angles and sharper words, was already out of the passenger side, her posture radiating an indignant fury that was as alien to this land as a snowstorm in July. She looked like a foreign object, a misplaced ornament, her pristine white linen shirt and tailored khaki pants utterly out of place against the backdrop of my weathered barn and the encroaching honeysuckle that had dared to creep its tendrils over the fence line. "Mr. Blackwood," her voice cut through the morning quiet like a rusty blade, or what was left of it. "I've had enough of this. I've called the sheriff. I'd nearly choked on a wad of chewing tobacco. The sheriff? For what? For the rumble of my tractor? For a bit of overgrown honeysuckle? It was absurd, preposterous, infuriating. I'd opened my mouth, ready to unleash a torrent of words that had been building inside me like pressure behind a dam. But then I saw him. The sheriff. He was a burly man with a kind face and a perpetually weary sigh that seemed to emanate from his very bones. Brody. Sheriff Brody. I knew him. He'd grown up a county over, a decent man who understood the rhythm of rural life, or so I'd thought. He'd always been fair. But it wasn't just Brody. Standing beside him, a few paces behind Eleanor, was another uniformed officer. He was younger, leaner, his uniform a crisp, dark blue that seemed to absorb the last vestiges of daylight. He stood with a professional stillness, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. And as he shifted his weight, the light caught his profile. My heart, usually steady as a plow horse, gave a lurch. The set of his jaw, the curve of his ear, the way his brow furrowed just slightly. It was a face I hadn't seen in, 10 years? More? A face I'd practically raised, a boy who used to follow me around the barn, his small hands smudged with grease, his wide, adoring eyes fixed on my every move. Daniel. My nephew. Daniel Blackwood. The world tilted. The carefully constructed grievances, the righteous anger that had been bubbling within me, evaporated like dew on a hot griddle. It was replaced by a deep, gnawing ache of confusion, a dizzying sense of disbelief. Daniel? Here? In uniform? Accompanying Eleanor Vance? What in tarnation? I started, my voice rough, unfamiliar even to myself. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his expression a mask of professional neutrality, though I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or a shadow of regret. Mr. Blackwood, he began, his voice a deep rumble. We've received a complaint. A complaint? I sputtered, gesturing wildly at my tractor, still idling with a low, steady thrum. This is my tractor, my livelihood. What kind of complaint could you possibly have about a tractor? Eleanor Vance huffed, stepping forward. It's a nuisance, Sheriff, a blight. It operates at all hours, spewing fumes and noise pollution, and the property lines are being encroached upon by Mr. Blackwood's overgrowth. The word overgrowth was spat out with such disdain, as if nature encroaching was a personal affront to her very existence. It's an assault on the senses and a violation of county ordinances. County ordinances. The phrase hung in the air, stark and absurd. I'd lived on this land for 40 years, seen droughts and floods, weathered economic storms that would have sunk lesser men, and now I was being threatened with removal by the sheriff, accompanied by my own nephew, because of a bit of honeysuckle and the honest rumble of a diesel engine. Ordinances? I managed, my voice a low growl. What ordinances are you talking about, Sheriff? This is my land. This tractor is my partner in coaxing life from this earth. It's the soundtrack to my life, not some infernal machine of destruction. Sheriff Brody held up a hand, a gesture of placation. There's a recent ordinance, Mr. Blackwood. Ordinance 47B, noise pollution and visual blight. Ms. Vance has filed a legitimate complaint. And Deputy Blackwood here. He gestured to Daniel, who remained impassive, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond me, as if I were merely an inconvenient obstacle, is here to assist me. Deputy Blackwood. The words landed like a physical blow. My nephew. The boy who'd once asked me to teach him how to change the oil on this very tractor. The boy who'd spent summers helping me mend fences, his small hands eager to learn. Now he was standing here, a sworn officer of the law, ready to enforce an ordinance against me, his own uncle. Deputy Blackwood, I said, my voice suddenly quiet, stripped of its earlier bluster. I looked directly at him, searching his face for any sign of recognition, any flicker of the boy I remembered. Daniel. You remember this old girl, don't you? I patted the warm, greasy metal of the tractor's fender. She's been with me through thick and thin. She's not a blight, son. She's part of this place. Part of me. Daniel's gaze finally met mine. For a fleeting moment, the professional demeanor he had clearly cultivated seemed to waver. His brow furrowed with a hint of unease, and his lips parted as if to speak. But then, just as quickly, the mask snapped back into place. His eyes, once so open and earnest, now held a practiced neutrality, a carefully constructed wall. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice clear and steady, devoid of any familial warmth. "I understand this is difficult, but Miss Vance's complaint is valid, and the ordinance is clear. The tractor is operating in violation of Section 3 of Ordinance 47B. It's creating excessive noise and contributing to visual blight on the property." He gestured vaguely towards Eleanor's manicured lawn, a perfectly trimmed emerald green that seemed to mock the wilder beauty of my own land. I stared at him, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over me. Betrayal, yes, but also a profound sense of disorientation. How could he stand there, his uniform a symbol of order and justice, and condemn the very thing that represented my life, my independence, my connection to this land? How could he, of all people, fail to see the injustice of it? "Visual blight?" I repeated, the words tasting like bitter bile. "This tractor has plowed more fields, harvested more crops, fed more families than that woman has probably even seen in her life. It's a symbol of hard work, Daniel, of sustenance. And as for noise, well, that's the sound of life, son. The sound of the earth being worked." Eleanor Vance scoffed. "Life! It's a racket, Mr. Blackwood, and your so-called overgrowth is practically consuming my property. It's an eyesore. This entire operation is a blight on this neighborhood." I turned back to Daniel, my voice dropping to a dangerous level. "And you, Daniel? You're going to let her dictate what constitutes blight on my land? You're going to let her tell me what noise is acceptable? You, my own flesh and blood, who I practically raised. I wrote your deed of appointment, Daniel. I helped you get through that academy. I vouched for you." The words tumbled out, a desperate plea laced with accusation. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a hint of the boy I knew. A flicker of discomfort beneath the polished exterior. "The deed of appointment was for the sheriff's department, Mr. Blackwood. My role here is as a sworn officer. I have to uphold the law. Miss Vance has a right to a peaceful enjoyment of her property." "Peaceful enjoyment?" I laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "She moved in 6 months ago, Daniel. 6 months. And she wants to change 40 years of rhythm and life into whatever sterile world she comes from. A world where milk comes from a carton and tractors are just loud metal boxes." I looked at him, my eyes pleading. "Surely you can see this is wrong." He wouldn't meet my gaze. His eyes scanned the horizon, the distant hills, anything but me. "The law is the law, Uncle Silas. I can't ignore a legitimate complaint. Ordinance 47B is clear." "Ordinance 47B," I muttered, the phrase a bitter mantra. It felt like a betrayal, not just by Daniel, but by the very system he now represented. I looked at Eleanor Vance, her face set in a smug, self-satisfied expression, and a chilling realization began to dawn. This wasn't just about noise or honeysuckle. This was about something else, something deeper, something that involved Daniel, and perhaps his newfound authority. The way he'd looked at me, that brief flicker of hesitation, then the swift return to his official capacity. It spoke of a conflict, a pressure he was under. A pressure that perhaps Eleanor Vance was expertly applying. "So," I said, the quiet in my voice more menacing than any shout, "you're going to take my tractor, because she said so, because of some made-up blight and noise ordinance, I looked at Sheriff Brody, hoping for a glimmer of reason. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his weary eyes fixed on Daniel. Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm not going to take your tractor, Mr. Blackwood. Not yet, but I am going to issue you a citation for violation of Ordinance 47B. And Ms. Vance has the right to pursue further action if the conditions are not rectified." He pulled a small notepad and pen from his pocket, his movements efficient and practiced. As he began to write, his pen scratching against the paper, a thought, cold and sharp, pierced through my daze. The deed of appointment. He'd said he wrote my deed of appointment. I'd helped him get into the academy. Yes, but there was something more. A piece of paperwork. A formality. Eleanor Vance. She was new. She was litigious. And Daniel was now a lawman. The gears of fate, it seemed, had just shifted with an almighty grind, and I was standing right in the path of the turning cogs. The scent of diesel and dust, usually so comforting, now felt heavy, suffocating. My tractor, my faithful partner, sat silent, its engine now off, a hulking, defeated beast. And I, Silas Blackwood, a man who had always prided himself on his independence, his connection to his land, felt utterly adrift. My nephew, the boy I'd taught to cast a fishing line, was now writing my citation. The irony was a bitter, bitter pill. The crunch of tires on gravel had been the first sign of trouble, a sound usually associated with a neighbor stopping by for a chat, or maybe the feed delivery truck. But the flashing lights, a stark, pulsating blue and red against the fading afternoon sun, told a different story. They were an intrusion, a jarring disruption to the symphony of diesel and dirt that was the soundtrack to my life. And then I saw her, Eleanor Vance, standing on her manicured lawn like a queen surveying her conquered territories, her posture a perfect illustration of disdain. She was all sharp angles and sharper words. A woman who probably thought milk came from a carton and that the biggest agricultural problem facing the world was an overgrowth of ornamental shrubs. She'd called the sheriff to remove my tractor, my John Deere, the beast that had been my partner in coaxing life from this earth for 40 years. The very machine that was as much a part of me as my own calloused hands, ingrained with soil and sweat. She'd cited noise pollution, visual blight, terms that tasted like bitter bile in my mouth. As if the guttural roar of that engine wasn't the sound of honest work, the sound of sustenance being wrenched from the stubborn clay. As if the sight of a well-used tractor wasn't as natural and necessary as the fields it tilled. And then he stepped out of one of those flashing patrol cars, a burly man with a kind face and a perpetually weary sigh, Sheriff Brody. I'd known Brody since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, a kid who used to trail after his own father, the sheriff before him. He acknowledged me with a nod, his expression a practiced neutrality that didn't quite hide the discomfort around his eyes. But it wasn't Brody who made my breath catch in my throat. My heart gave a jolt that felt like a physical blow. It was the other one. The younger officer, standing a step behind Brody, his uniform crisp, his posture ramrod straight. He was tall, lean, with that familiar set of the jaw that I'd seen 1,000 times before, usually accompanied by a mischievous grin or a smudge of dirt across his nose. It was Daniel. My nephew, Daniel. The world tilted. The carefully constructed grievances, the legal jargon Vance had spat out like venom, the flashing lights, it all receded into a hazy, disbelieving blur. Daniel. The boy I'd practically raised, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, who'd spent countless summers in the shadow of that very tractor, his wide, adoring eyes following my every move. He'd loved the rumble of the engine, the smell of diesel and dust. He'd always wanted to be out here, with me, in the fields. And now he was here, on the other side of the law, a sworn officer of the law, responding to a complaint against me. The irony was so thick, so profoundly absurd, it was almost suffocating. He'd always been a bright boy, Daniel, always asking questions, always eager to learn. I'd taught him how to change a tire on my old pickup, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to coax life from the earth. He'd seemed so at home in this rough and tumble reality. Mr. Blackwood. Sheriff Brody's voice cut through the sudden, suffocating silence, pulling me back to the present. We received a complaint regarding excessive noise and visual blight, sir, from Ms. Vance. He gestured vaguely towards Eleanor, who was now fanning herself with an imaginary fan, her expression one of supreme impatience. I stared at Daniel. His face was a mask of professional impassivity, but I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or a shadow of regret. He avoided my gaze, his attention fixed somewhere beyond my shoulder, on the West 40. Visual blight? I managed to croak out, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. That tractor's been working this ground for longer than she's been breathing air in this county. I looked back at Daniel. And noise pollution? It's the sound of livelihood, son. The sound of life. Daniel finally looked at me. His brow furrowed with a hint of unease, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady, formal. Silas, I'm sorry, but we have to follow procedure. Ms. Vance has filed a formal complaint. It's a county ordinance violation. He spoke with a practiced cadence, the words sounding rehearsed, like something he'd drilled a dozen times. Procedure? The word felt like a betrayal. Daniel, that's my tractor. That's my land. You know that. My voice was rising, the anger I'd been holding at bay beginning to boil over. The ground felt suddenly unsteady beneath my worn boots. Eleanor Vance scoffed. Honestly, Sheriff, the melodrama. It's a nuisance vehicle. It's an eyesore. It's interfering with my enjoyment of my property. That thing is a blight on this neighborhood. She spat out the word blight with such disdain it felt like a personal insult. To her, I supposed, it was. To her, the natural order of things, the life that had always pulsed through this valley, was an affront. Daniel shifted his weight, his gaze darting between me and Vance. Ms. Vance, we need to issue a citation. Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to have to ask you to temporarily remove the tractor from the property until this can be properly addressed. Temporarily remove it? The thought was preposterous, infuriating. That tractor was my partner in coaxing life from Earth, a symbol of my livelihood, my independence, my connection to this land. It wasn't a nuisance vehicle. It was an extension of myself. Remove it where, Daniel? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. You want me to park it in the barn? It's where it belongs. It's part of the farm. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on Daniel's shoulder, a gesture of subtle authority, or perhaps just reassurance. Silas, the citation is for the noise and the visual aspect. Ms. Vance has the right to pursue this. We're not confiscating it, just asking for it to be moved, to de-escalate the situation for now. She's threatened to take further legal action if nothing is done. Legal action? I repeated, the words hanging in the air, stark and absurd. Over my tractor? A disbelieving laugh escaped my lips, a short, sharp bark of pure incredulity. What in tarnation is going on here? Daniel's expression tightened, a subtle shift that I, who knew him better than anyone, could still read. Silas, please, just put it in the barn, for now. We can talk about this later. Talk about what, Daniel? My voice was a low growl. About how my own nephew, the boy I taught to drive a stick shift in this very truck, is now telling me my tractor is a nuisance? about how a woman who probably thinks manure is a type of fertilizer is dictating what happens on my land? Eleanor Vance let out a delicate, tinkling laugh. Such a quaint vocabulary. Tarnation. Honestly, this is hardly the place for such rustic outbursts. Sheriff, is there a timeline on this? I have guests arriving for dinner, and I'd prefer not to have that behemoth looming over the property line. Brody sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of every dispute he'd ever mediated. We'll give you an hour, Silas. Just get it under cover. We'll be back to check. He handed me a slip of paper.